Senator Singh.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President, and I rise to contribute Labor's position to this bill, the Environment Legislation Amendment Bill 2013. Labor is happy to see that the government has changed its approach by making some of these changes to conservation advice retrospective only. But before I get on to the substance of this bill, I am surprised that the government has brought this bill forward when, its order of business continues to chop and change all over the place. Yesterday we were continuing with the National Water Commission. I understand that the National Water Commission Abolition Bill will come on for debate at some point today, but I just find it very bizarre the way this government is trying to run this place by chopping and changing its program when it comes to legislation, especially environment legislation, because as we know, Mr Acting Deputy President, there is no good news when it comes to the environment for this government, no good news at all. And that, of course, will be debated soon when we look at the National Water Commission Abolition Bill, which stands along with all the other environmental-related or climate change-related abolition bills that it has tried to put into this place, that have been all steps to take Australia backwards when it comes to protecting our unique environment, but also in contributing and doing our part for climate change. This particular amendment bill, the Environment Legislation Amendment Bill, has a number of components to it, a number of scheduled amendments. As I said at the outset, that Labor is pleased that the government's changed its approach in relation to changes to conservation advice, making those retrospective only. We recognise that many projects that have been approved are already at the development stage and that Australian jobs should not be jeopardised due to a technicality. The problem identified by the Environment Minister this was the then Environment Minister, Tony Burke, was one of the department's making. In fact, it was indeed the department that failed to provide the separate piece of paper on conservation issues that were dealt with throughout a range of other briefing documents, and that is what led to the issues and the confusion that went forthwith. But allowing previously approved projects, Labor believes, to carry on will ensure that business confidence and jobs for Australian families are protected. So that is a good move. That is part of this particular amendment bill. But given the government's overall agenda for the environment, I have to say, Mr Acting Deputy President, one cannot help but think that this bill is a bit of a sideshow, because we have had a government now systematically dismantling any policy that will help us respond to climate change, whether it's the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the Climate Change Authority, getting rid of a ceiling or a legal cap on carbon pollution. We know the history is right there for all to see that this is the government that took us backwards on climate change. So I do find it a little bit bizarre that this government brings on this piece of legislation today, which, as we know, does have a focus on turtles and dugongs, and I'll get to those forthwith, when on every other environment measure it has certainly taken this country backwards. We do have a government that is hell-bent on handing over environmental approval powers to states and local governments, weakening those powers, leaving people or premiers, for example, like Campbell Newman, or even the Mayor of Mackay in charge of the Great Barrier Reef. The Mayor of Mackay would have more sway and more powers in decision-making processes over the Great Barrier Reef than the Minister for the Environment. So that is the sideshow that I highlight in relation to the bill before us, the fact that the government simply cannot get its act together on the environment. It has been a laughingstock and an embarrassment, not just at the national level but at the international level. And now today, on the very last day, well, one would hope the very last day of Parliament sitting, it brings forth this Environment Legislation Amendment Bill, which does have some positive components, as I've outlined, that we're pleased, Labor is pleased the government has finally seen important to amend. If I could just go to Schedule 1, which is the removing ability to challenge decisions on certain grounds. Under the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, the EPBC Act, environmental approval decisions made by the Minister are open to potential legal challenges. Now, I mentioned those in relation to the former Minister, Labor Minister Burke. This has not changed with the bill that is before the Senate. So Labor supports an amendment to the EPBC Act, which protects projects that were approved prior to 31st December 2013 from legal challenge on the basis that the Minister did not consider separate conservation advice as part of that decision-making process. But this problem was caused, as I said, by the Environment Department not providing a particular piece of paper regarding advice on conservation issues, advice that was provided in a range of other briefing documents and formed part of decision-making processes. So we recognise that many projects that have been approved are already at the development stage, and that's why jobs should not be jeopardised, and that's why, due to this technicality, that we do support the government Schedule 1. Allowing previously approved projects to carry on, of course, will ensure that there is business confidence. But Labor also supports the community's right to challenge government decisions which impact their environment, their livelihoods or their way of life. So this amendment does not limit the right to challenge on any other grounds. So that is why Labor will be supporting Schedule 1. Now, if I can move to Schedule 2, Labor also supports Schedule 2 of this bill, which attempts to provide greater protections for turtles and dugongs. We know that the Minister has some regard for turtles and dugongs. However, it does not provide what is really needed. More resources and more support for Indigenous groups to enable them to police their own communities on land and sea is what is really needed. And this was a constant theme in evidence and submissions to the Legislation Committee's inquiry into this bill. I'm sure that Senator Birmingham is aware of that evidence. So what this bill does is merely increase existing penalties for illegal hunting. Penalties, I have to say, are one thing, but these are penalties that have never even been used before. It is the resources resources to enforce a law, not penalties on paper, that is really the crucial element here. So I do think that needs to be highlighted strongly. That all that this particular schedule does is increase penalties. Resources are the key if we are going to want to really look after and save and protect turtles and dugongs. Penalties could be, here for 100 years, but without, their enforcement, they're pointless. We all know that. And I think the fact that penalties have never been used before does raise some questions. So, all well and good to, increase penalties, but let's be real about this. It's more important, I think, to highlight the issue of resources. Also, though, the government didn't consult with Indigenous groups in Queensland and the Northern Territory. They did not consult with traditional owners, and they didn't consult with the Land and Sea Councils. So if the Minister had bothered to consult, he would have found out very quickly, that the real need is in resourcing current management plans and enabling the enforcement of the law rather than merely increasing penalties. Now, Labor recognises the increasing penalties is part of a broader plan, though. It certainly is part of a broader plan to protect turtles and dugongs, and that is a good thing. I note, in fact, the WWF, World Wildlife Fund in Australia, have done a lot of work in this regard in relation to dugongs in particular. They've highlighted how dugongs are listed globally as vulnerable to extinction. They've highlighted that Australian waters are home to at least 3/4 of the global population and a vitally important stronghold for the species. They've also highlighted that the populations of dugongs worldwide have become increasingly fragmented and that anecdotal evidence suggests the numbers are declining as a result of the loss and degradation of seagrass meadows, fishing pressures, Indigenous hunting and coastal pollution. So I think we all know the importance of turtles and dugongs. It's what this government is going to do about it that's important. And as I made it very clear, I don't think that simply amending this schedule to increase penalties without addressing the issues of resourcing is going to make a difference. And I think the fact that there was no consultation done by this government again is snubbing those particular traditional owners. It is snubbing the land and sea councils who are on the ground and who have detailed understanding of the plight of these particular animals. Now, as I said, Labor recognises that increasing penalties is part of this broader plan of this government to protect turtles and dugongs. But this plan includes funding for Indigenous rangers, and for that we do support the government's efforts, and we always have supported funding for Indigenous rangers. It provides funding as well to clean up ghost nets. Again, this was something when Labor was in government, also funded these endeavours. So that is a positive step made continuing on from Labor's approach as well. It also provides funding to care for and rehabilitate turtles and dugongs that have been injured in the seas of northern Queensland, another good component. The government's plan also includes $2 million for an Australian Crime Commission investigation into illegal killing of turtles and dugongs and illegal transport of the meat. Now, I have to say, this does sound like a clear case of overkill. Why doesn't the government work with local communities rather than, going straight to the ACCC, the Australian Crime Commission, and giving them $2 million and having it dealt with at this kind of top end? I mean, this seems to be the ongoing approach by this government. Increase the penalties, get the Australian Crime Commission involved, give them lots of money, don't talk to anyone, don't find out what's going on the ground, ignore expert advice, people every day dealing with some of these issues. I do think that this isn't the way to go. I do think it's a case of overkill, and I actually strongly urge the Minister and his department to consult. The word consult needs to be brought into the lexicon of this government so that they do consult with traditional owners and to formulate a realistic plan for the protection and management of turtles and dugongs in Northern Australia. We will support the government in this approach if they were to do that. Having said that, Labor will not stand in the way of Schedule 2 of this bill. We believe in the principle of Schedule 2 in this bill, but we would, as I said, be happy to work with the government to provide a real and long-lasting protection through enabling Indigenous groups to adequately police their own laws and customs. That is really the way to address the plight of turtles and dugongs and the issues that are facing them, and I really urge the Minister to address that. Marine turtles and dugongs are impacted, as we know, by a range of enduring threats, including, as I said before, habitat loss, poor water quality, bycatch, poaching, marine debris and boat strike. In government, Labor made effectively addressing these issues a really high priority. And this work continues in close association with state and territory governments, traditional owners and other stakeholder groups such as commercial fishers. We also invested $7 million in Indigenous self-management because this is the best way to ensure the sustainable and appropriate management of the dugongs and turtles. Critically, Labor's approach included leadership and advice on the take of marine turtles and dugong, developing community-based sea country management plans and support for traditional owner involvement in sustainable use of marine resources and compliance training. So I think the government can learn from what Labor did in office in relation to this approach, and we would welcome them taking this kind of approach into the future rather than just this punitive raising of penalties approach. We also supported Indigenous ranger teams to remove ghost nets, and that is lost or abandoned nets, which impact on turtle and dugong populations. Our approach was based on our respect for the custom and traditions of Indigenous Australians and the right under the Native Title Act for traditional owners to hunt native species for personal, domestic or non-commercial communal needs. So we do support a balanced approach to traditional hunting and the sustainability of native species such as turtles and dugongs. Now, I do understand there are some other components to this amendment bill that I think were going to be amendments moved by the Greens. We will have a look at those in the course of this debate. I'm unsure as to whether Senator Xenophon also has amendments that he is going to bring forward at this point in time, but again, Labor will look at those as well during the course of this debate. But this main part of this bill are those two schedules, the ones that I've just gone through in my contribution to this debate, Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. I will say that it is important when we address this part of the EPBC Act that we highlight that it is about Australia being well informed about our biodiversity through the work that needs to be done by government and by community, by NGOs, traditional owners and the like. So I think if there is some way in which these amendments address those issues, then that is a good thing. But I do want to stress that there are ways of doing things, and whilst Labor won't stand in the way of Schedule 2, I really do want to stress the importance of the government consulting those particular groups that I related to. The fact that they do have the expertise and the knowledge, they are out there. They're out there in Queensland and Northern Australia and the like on the ground. They're not here in Canberra in departments kind of making decisions in silos. So it is important that those in government do take their advice and their knowledge into account. Now, finally, I would like to say that the other part of this that makes this so important is the fact that Australia has signed a number of international treaties, which of course guide our protection and management of a number of important species and ecological communities. Some of those treaties, for example, as we know, the Convention on Biodiversity, the Convention on Wetlands for International Importance, especially as waterfowl habitat, the Convention on the Protection of World Cultural and Natural Heritage, and the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals. All of these kinds of conventions need to be taken into account when we do look at amending the EPBC Act. It is important that Australia lives up to its obligations under those treaties. Finally, thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President, and Labor will support these two schedules within the bill.
Thank you, Senator Singh. Your time has expired.